All right, I'll let everyone in, Atalina, and now it's on to you.
Aloha kako. Mahalo everyone for joining us. Ovao no Atalina Pasi. And it is with deep gratitude and humility that I welcome you on behalf of our emerging Oahu Island-wide Resilience Hub Network to the Hawaii State Hubs Virtual Forum 2024. This marks our third year gathering together, and we are incredibly grateful to the unwavering efforts of Ramona Mulehi for continuously bringing us together for these important discussions. Mahalo nui, Ramona. This year, we focus on funding and resources for resilient communities, a vital theme as we work to build the resilience of our communities. From the grassroots hubs to the broader networks that support island-wide and statewide efforts. We are honored by the presence of our esteemed presenters from the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, the EPA, FEMA, and Skog Rasmussen LLC. Their ike, knowledge, and expertise will guide us as we strive to secure the resources and support necessary for our initiatives. To all of you joining us today, we extend a warm aloha and mahalo for being part of this important conversation. Your participation strengthens our collective efforts to create a more resilient Hawaii. Before we begin, I turn the mic over to Ramona Mulehi, who will introduce our esteemed panel of speakers. I'd like to invite our co-host to offer a few opening mana'o thoughts to set the tone for our discussion today. We're privileged to have with us Philip Ong, representing Vibrant Hawaii as a member of its leadership council. Philip, the floor is yours.
Mahalo, Atalina. It's wonderful to be a part of this statewide cohort and to host such an expert panel of speakers today. Here in Hawaii Island, with our fair share of natural threats, our work began in a response to disaster, probably similar to others in attendance today. For some of us, it began during and after the 2018 Kilauea eruption, before rolling into COVID, which offered Vibrant Hawaii its first chance to serve our island-wide communities. Our vision of resilience hubs has evolved since then, inspired in part by the model put forth by the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, but adapted to the specific needs and culture within each community that we serve. Hawaii Island's network now includes a Resilience Alliance that engages and coordinates local businesses that can offer support during a response, points of distribution for getting resources widely into our communities, and resilience hubs themselves, which maintain a community presence full time. Everyone can see the benefit of hubs during disasters, but creating resiliency also requires a ton of work during blue sky times, as each hub offers outreach and services tailored to the community while planning, building capacity, and exercising joint responses with our Hawaii County Civil Defense. We've implemented communication systems, backups with Starlink and generators, information sharing protocols, and partnerships with digital resilience hubs through HVERI. All this sounds amazing, but our challenge today is how to sustain this work in between disasters without getting complacent about it. It's easier to get funding when disasters put eyeballs in our communities, but really it's a full-time job. And for that, we need funding and resources. So we'll be listening closely to our esteemed guests today. So mahalo everyone for joining us and supporting our communities here in Hawaii. And with that, I'll pass it to Jill. Jill, are you with us?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm also very grateful to have been invited to co-host this forum. I've been doing disaster resilience work for about 4 years, and my focus is more or less on programmatic and more on structural changes that working towards um, engaging and facilitating conversation about the need for climate ready structures, and particularly with disaster shelters that are equipped to handle category 5 or greater, as well as wildfires. And it is possible, but takes intentional desire, funding, et cetera, to make that happen. And so anybody that is here today that has an interest in structures, certainly reach out to me at another time. But it is very heartwarming to see so many people that are in this conversation now, that it's taken a while for us all to come together. But I think today is going to be particularly beneficial because funding is at the heart of getting done what we need to get done. So thank you for joining us. I look forward to hearing everybody's comments. And ultimately now I'll pass it back to you. Thank you so much.
Mahalo, Jill. Our rural communities, places like Ko'olauloa, Molokai, and Hana, are the living heartbeat of our Aina, carrying the traditions and knowledge of our kupuna. Yet they face unique challenges, limited health care, fragile infrastructure, and access to resources, particularly during crises. To strengthen these communities, we must focus on kuleana, our responsibility, by ensuring they receive sustained funding and resources. This is not just about short-term relief, but long-term investments in health, education, and Aina-based practices that protect their future. Providing for these communities is an act of aloha, ensuring that they have the tools for malama to care for both their people and land. When we uplift our rural areas, we uplift the resilience of all Hawai'i. Their strength, rooted in aloha aina, is key to creating a thriving, sustainable future for our entire Pai'aina. Mahalo nui to everyone working to ensure that these communities are seen, heard, and supported. Together, we can ensure that Hawai'i's rural voices and values continue to lead us forward. And we are grateful for Oahu, Island-Wide Emergency Hub Network, for giving focus and attention to our rural communities moving forward. Now I would like to turn the time over to Ramona Mulehi, who will present our opening panel and share her mana'o as we open this space for dialogue. Ramona.
Mahalo, Atalina, and mahalo both Philip and Jill and Miku, who's behind the scenes. I'm super thrilled to be able to join you and bring some of these resources and go on a journey in regards to both funding and resources and the way that we innovate, leverage, partner, and strengthen our resilience efforts. The first on our guided tour of funding and resources will be Emily Gar Pachetti. She's a senior principal and interim community affairs officer with the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. At the Federal Reserve Bank, what she does is oversees its community development work, including research, policy analysis, and community outreach in the 4th Federal Reserve District, which covers Ohio, parts of Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and West Virginia. Previously, she worked at Rockefeller Foundation, for which she developed and managed initiatives designed to support more inclusive and resilient cities and regions in the US and globally. Welcome to FEMA Elizabeth Corrigan from DC. She is the Climate Communications and Policy Analyst for the Climate Branch Office of Resilience Strategy for FEMA. She has spent a decade working in disaster response and recovery and leads climate policy and communication efforts for the Climate Resilience Branch. She is passionate about improving FEMA policy and processes to streamline opportunities for applicants across the nation. Hooray, Elizabeth. Next would be from Housing and Urban Development, Regina Gray, who's Director of the Affordable Housing Research and Technology Division for the Office of Policy Development and Research. Regina's research activities range from sustainable development, urban design, land use planning, transit-oriented development, to energy and green buildings. She has managed many of HUD's initiatives, including establishing benchmarks for reducing energy usage in public housing development. Following her will be FEMA, Michelle Beasley for Region 9. She's the Federal Disaster Recovery Officer. She has spent over 2 decades working in community development, environmental, health, civic engagement, and technology across both public and private sectors in the West. She and her team have created some really terrific resource guides that she will share today also. Then will come from EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, Sharon Bowen. She's Inflation Reduction Act Coordinator, Grant Project Officer for Region 9 EPA. She manages various air quality grants to local agencies and nonprofits, and she covers the Pacific Island territories and Hawaii. Next, from Hawaii, we have Gwen Yamamoto Lau, who's the Executive Director from the Hawaii Green Infrastructure Authority, which is under DBEDT, Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, where she administers the Green Infrastructure Loan Program to make clean energy investments affordable to Hawaii's underserved ratepayers and to stimulate investment. And she does a whole lot of other things, but the couple others that I'd like to point out, she's recently launched a commercial property assessed clean energy and resiliency called CPACER financing program. And she is about to launch the Solar Hui program with a $62.4 million EPA grant. Hooray and congratulations, Gwen. And the closer of this journey will be Melissa Unimori Hump. She is with Skog Rasmussen LLC, and she brings decades of public, private, and nonprofit experience working with entities in Hawaii and across the country, providing government relations and grants-related work. One of the things that she has outstandingly done is develop and co-led statewide initiatives with the Hawaii Alliance for Nonprofit Organizations to help nonprofits bring grant funding to Hawaii, and I think they've brought 25 million. So without any further ado, Emily, hats off to you. Kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ramona. I am just so grateful to be here with you all today and be part of this forum and share a little bit of information from my perspective here in Ohio. And I'll tell you why the heck I'm on this this forum in a minute. But just very grateful to be here with you all, share my point of view, but also listen and learn from all of your experiences and all the incredible professionals that are on this forum today to share resources and tools. My name is Emily Garpachetti. As Ramona mentioned, I'm the Senior Principal over the Community Development Department here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. Because I work for the Federal Reserve, I am beholden to say that my views are my own and they're not that of the Federal Reserve Bank or the Federal Reserve System. With that, I just want to say when Ramona asked me to speak just for a few minutes at the opening, my first reaction was just very humbled, but more so excited, because it meant that some of our work is reaching the audiences it's meant to reach. Something that we care about a lot at the Federal Reserve within community development is providing resources to people who can use them. And recently, given the federal funding that is available specifically to lower and moderate income communities, we're very interested in better understanding whether or not it's actually getting to the people that it's intended to. So with that, I did recently write an article and just trying to better understand how federal funds were reaching folks in our part of the district, and very quickly understood that it was, in fact, a national issue, not something that is local. So I did want to mention that the very existence of this forum just sends a very strong message about how engaged partners across Hawaii are. I've been very impressed with the whole organization of this forum, but it also is so important that people are aware. And not only that people are aware, but they have the tools and resources to help with the deployment of some of these federal funds to the places that need it most. So with that, next slide, please. I only will take up a couple minutes here, but I did want to share a little bit about the Fed for those of you who don't know us. So you'll see I'm part of the 4th district over in Ohio, that little red part of the district. We also cover parts of West Virginia, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania. Of course, Hawaii is part of the Fed's 12th district. Your point of contact there is John Ford, for those of you who don't know John, and we can provide his email when the slides are distributed as part of the deck. So our community development departments are a very small part of the broader Fed system. And if you don't know the Federal Reserve, it has 5 functions. You might hear about us about interest rates set in the news, but we not only conduct the nation's monetary policy, we also promote stability in the financial system. We supervise and regulate financial institutions, and we foster payments and settlement systems, but we also promote consumer protection and community development. And that's where we come in to really focus and understand what lower income people and communities are experiencing in the economy. And that emerged from the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977. One of the things that we do is really try to take a pulse on what people are experiencing in lower income communities, as well as understand some of the structural issues that they contend with. And as new federal funding comes out, especially since much of it is directed through the Justice 40 initiative and many other related initiatives, we're certainly paying attention to federal funding and how it's getting deployed in our district. So next slide, please. I am here because I wanted to share a little bit about what we are learning in our part of the country, and then expand that to what we've been hearing more nationally. So in the Federal Reserve's 4th district, you'll see the geography that we represent here. There were a few things that stuck out to us when we surveyed leaders in community development back in the spring. And we always ask about funding. And so we've been asking people about funding and capacity and demand for services ever since 2018. And we ask this question 2 times a year. And the first thing that sticks out, if you can see on the right within this chart, is that the demand for services still remains elevated. And so this has been consistent for at least 5 years now, and of course was raised during and after COVID. We just keep seeing demand at a pretty elevated rate from survey period to survey period. Second, the share of people who said that funding was increasing is actually going down because of a lot of the pandemic era aid. We're just hearing just in the last year that a lot of that has expired or is going away. ARPA funds are getting spent. They have to go out by the end of this year. So it's a very mixed picture. And that mixed picture is represented by that middle bar, because you see that most people, about 50% of stakeholders that we talk to, they weren't seeing any movement up or down, but it's really the ends that I'm paying attention to and that are the very interesting pictures. So as you have pandemic era aid expiring, you also have new funds coming online. And this is the really interesting part of the story, I think. And this is where, when we get out, surveys are one thing, but when you get out and talk to partners, we just kept hearing that people weren't aware of the federal funding, that localities and leaders in those city governments or county governments, especially in rural areas and smaller cities, they didn't have time to navigate the 70 plus agencies or hundreds plus programs that were out there to deliver funding. And so there really was this gap in knowledge and understanding of the federal funds that were out there and how they could be deployed to best effect across the region. We do know from research, and this is national, from some of my colleagues at the San Francisco Fed and others, we do know that there are some things that we learned from pandemic era deployment of aid. That is that new technologies are helpful in continuing to leverage funding and investment and think about connecting with people in new ways. That has really been leveraged successfully by a lot of nonprofits or nonprofit networks, which brings me to my next point, that networks are increasingly important and collaboration is increasingly important. So it's lovely to see just the diversity of people on this call, and also the speakers of a lot of different folks from different sectors coming together to try to figure out how to work together to deploy some of this funding to the people who need it most. And third, I just wanted to say that, it really is about whether or not this funding will do what we want it to do, right? And early data are promising. There is some research out from the Upjohn Institute and Brookings and others that shows that some of the early investments into distressed areas are in fact effective at increasing jobs in those disadvantaged and distressed areas. Of course, it's very early days. A lot of these funding, have a long tail, and we'll see that for a long time, but the early data is promising. So next slide, please. And here are just some examples of, and you're going to get a lot of these slides today of just examples of different tools and resources that might be helpful in our journey as we try to figure out, what funds are available and for what projects. I wanted to note the local infrastructure hub. It's hosted by a number of different philanthropies on the website of National League of Cities, but is a product of a lot of different partners who just wanted to provide a place for folks to go, kind of a first stop when you're trying to navigate the different resources available, and then tracking how the funds are being spent. So that's the local infrastructure hub. The federal infrastructure hub is a little more narrow. It's specifically about a lot of the infrastructure funding, and they provide some points of contact where there are new notices of funding available, et cetera. And then the 10,000 Communities Initiative by the Milken Institute. I've heard some great feedback about that one. Federal Reserve reports and research I just highlighted a few. Some are specific to Hawaii that were done by my San Francisco Fed colleagues. And I really just hope, as I leave you all and we transition to the next speakers, I really just hope that the dialogue continues across geographies, because I think a lot of our challenges are very, very different. But at the same time, I think we can learn a lot from each other and what we're experiencing, and try to navigate the landscape the best we can together. So please feel free to put questions or comments in the chat. I love and appreciate feedback on these resources or others that you all have that you found helpful in your journey, and hope to continue the dialogue. So with that, I will turn it over to Elizabeth Corrigan, I believe.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you all so much for inviting me to speak today. My name is Elizabeth Corrigan. I'm with the Climate Resilience Office out of FEMA headquarters. During the introduction of today's session, it was mentioned a number of recent disasters that have happened in Hawaii. And so I know that many on the line today are very intimately aware of the disaster landscape that Hawaii experiences. And I'm excited to be here today and talk about some of the FEMA recovery and mitigation grant opportunities and some of the recent changes in this space that are really exciting. Some of the updates that took place from the recent passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. Go to the next slide, please. The Inflation Reduction Act, you all probably remember seeing in the news, was passed back in 2022. It was really wide-reaching climate legislation that was historical and the first of its kind for our nation. Some of the overarching goals from this legislation you can see here on the screen: so reducing greenhouse gas emissions, in half by 2030, achieving net zero emissions, advancing environmental justice, funding clean energy, cutting energy costs, tax incentives, really, really wide-reaching. Go to the next slide, please. FEMA received some very specific new authorities in this legislation. Essentially allows FEMA to rebuild after disasters in a much more climate-friendly and clean energy way than we were previously allowed to. So you see on the screen here, this is the text exactly from the legislation. So it says that we can cover costs associated with low carbon materials and incentives that encourage low carbon and net zero energy projects. So two very short sentences in this legislation, but really a game changer for our agency. Typically, FEMA is required by law to rebuild after disasters to meet what's called pre-disaster conditions. So whatever is there prior to a disaster, by law, we are required to rebuild it to those same conditions. On top of that, we also have a number of grant programs that allow us to rebuild to prevent and reduce future risk. So things like hazard mitigation or hardening of structures to reduce the risk of future hazards. And now, due to this legislation, we can also rebuild in a greener, more environmentally friendly and more sustainable way. Go to the next slide, please. Next slide. One more, please. So you can see on the slide that we have up now, these are 5 grant programs that FEMA is eligible to rebuild in these new, greener, more environmentally friendly ways. And just to give you an example, FEMA spent north of $12 billion just in 2023 on rebuilding post-disaster and rebuilding for mitigation purposes. So we're a very large player in the infrastructure space with a significant number of resources that get activated during federally declared disasters and for mitigation purposes. If you go just backwards one slide, you can see on this slide that the reason why this is so important is that 40% of greenhouse gas emissions globally come from the built environment. And what do we mean by the built environment? This is 2 specific areas. One is building materials and construction. So that's when we're thinking about things like concrete or asphalt, steel. This is a significant industry that contributes to a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. The other portion is around building operations. So this is when we're thinking of things like electricity, heating, cooling, everything that it takes for a building to operate. So this sector is contributing to a very significant level of greenhouse gas emissions. And it's the part that this legislation is really targeting for FEMA, right? Because it's allowing us to take actions in our construction and infrastructure work to lower emissions in these 2 areas. Next slide, please. And go forward one more. Okay, so now I'm going to talk just a little bit about these 2 specific areas. So the first is low carbon building materials. And what do we mean by a low carbon building material? The EPA has defined this really specifically for federal agencies, with the quote that you see on the screen here saying low carbon building materials have substantially lower levels of embodied greenhouse gas emissions associated with all relevant stages of production, use, and disposal as compared to estimated industry averages of similar materials or products. This is very technical language to say that we are encouraging applicants to utilize low carbon construction materials that are made in a more sustainable and environmentally friendly way. So these 4 materials that you see on the screen are the largest contributors of greenhouse gas emissions: concrete, glass, asphalt, and steel. And there are environmentally friendly versions of these materials that have come with what's called an environmental product declaration. This is essentially a label for low carbon materials. And these materials are made in a way that significantly reduces greenhouse gas emissions. FEMA receives grants for infrastructure projects that are repetitive in nature every year. So things like resurfacing roads or bridge construction, projects that use a large amount of asphalt and concrete. And these projects are all eligible to be utilizing low carbon versions of these materials for those infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. The use of low carbon materials in FEMA projects can reduce the embodied carbon of a building project. Embodied carbon refers to the emissions associated with the construction of building, starting with the extraction of raw materials through production, transport, and manufacturing. Reducing embodied carbon is key to addressing global industrial and building sector emissions. So when we're looking at global greenhouse gas emissions, the industrial sector is the largest, you see here at 30%, and is the critical to abate emission sector because it takes high temperatures to heat and process these materials. And emissions from processing can't be addressed with existing decarbonization efforts like electrification or installing solar, wind, etc. So the top two industrial sectors alone, steel and cement, are each individually responsible for more emissions than all commercial building energy use each year, and a significant portion of the materials produced by these sectors are used to build buildings and other infrastructure. So again, really important emphasis on specific materials. Next slide, please. In addition to reducing the embodied carbon in materials, these also create the opportunity for healthier, less polluted air and environments, particularly for people who live near manufacturing facilities and facilities like landfills where construction materials make up approximately 40% of current waste. So providing an opportunity to not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also create healthier communities for those living near these facilities. Next slide, please. Now I'm just going to talk briefly about net zero energy projects. So again, this is the opportunity to utilize FEMA funding for disaster recovery and mitigation infrastructure to rebuild in a way that is significantly lessening greenhouse gas emissions. So we are now able to rebuild buildings that are damaged or destroyed during a disaster, utilizing net zero energy building practices. Net zero energy projects at FEMA must include renewable energy, an amount equivalent to or greater than the annual energy consumption of the entire facility. In addition, applicants can include energy efficient appliances and materials in their projects, which reduce the amount of energy needed overall to power the facility. The lower picture, or the picture on the screen, sorry, on the next slide, shows an example. And so you can see on the screen, we have diagrammed here an example of a school that was impacted by a disaster. So you could imagine a hurricane or a flood or a wildfire destroys a school, and the community is eligible to rebuild that school utilizing FEMA funding. So the school can be rebuilt utilizing solar or another renewable energy to power that facility. This provides energy security for that facility so that if there is a power outage to the grid, then the solar can be utilized to keep the school open or be used as an emergency shelter during a disaster. Similarly, if the entire school wasn't destroyed, but just a portion of that school, so maybe just the library or the gymnasium or the cafeteria, you could rebuild just that portion of the school and make that portion net zero energy, meaning that it's powered by renewable energy. Next slide, please. So I have my contact information on here and my team's contact information. I know I covered that at a pretty high level, and FEMA projects can be very detailed. So definitely please do not hesitate to reach out to myself or my team We are happy to talk on these project types all day long, every day with anybody that has questions. So definitely don't hesitate to reach out or put questions in the chat, and I will be around for some time now and can take a look at those as well. Thank you all.
I think it's Regina.
Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Washington, D.C. I am Regina Gray from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. I am very, very honored to be here this afternoon to learn more about what my colleagues around the country are doing to address climate resilience and building more community resilient communities all across the United States. I have a lot of information to share with you, so I'm going to go ahead and get started and try to get through as much of this information as I can. I'll start with an overview of what we face in terms of our challenges in getting to a less carbon dependent world. I'll go into a little bit about what we are doing in the Office of Policy Development and Research. That is my shop, and we focus on a lot of research and data around climate and energy analysis. So I want to share with you some of the work that we're doing there. I'll move along by talking about some of our tools and resources, give you some examples of demonstrations, and then we'll close out. So next slide, please. Next slide. Hi. Okay. The challenge. All right. So from a HUD perspective, of course, climate change disproportionately harms Americans who are low and moderate income and who systematically suffer more burdens as a result of being in communities that are not resilient. This includes formerly redline neighborhoods that have often fewer resources and fewer built environment features in their neighborhoods, including fewer trees and impervious pavement. And so when a climate or disaster strikes, damages from these disasters have been shown to increase wealth inequality for these low-income communities, especially communities of color. And so HUD is working hard to find ways or find solutions to not only build more resilient communities, but to elevate equity in all of our processes from start to finish. Next slide. So between 1901 and 2016, I want to point out that the average temperature across the contiguous United States has increased by 1 degree Celsius. Rising temperatures, as we know, have impacted human safety, infrastructure, agriculture, water quality and quantity, as well as natural ecosystems around the United States. And scientists, as we all know, predict that the current conditions maintained, if the current conditions are maintained, the average temperature will rise above 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Some states have already surpassed this benchmark, including New Jersey, Delaware, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and I want to add in Florida as another state. Next slide. So as a result, HUD has issued a climate action plan, and I'll give you an overview of this plan. There are 3 goals involved in the climate action plan. One is to increase climate resilience, and we do this by increasing our information and data and research that will help us plan where the most vulnerable places are around the country and direct our resources to those places. Under this goal are other tasks or other initiatives that we have to strengthen mortgage financing, disaster recovery and resilience, and expand our capacity building within and also working with our fellow agencies in Washington, D.C., including FEMA, Department of Energy, EPA, Department of Transportation, and many others. The second goal is to reduce greenhouse gas pollution. That includes decarbonization in our buildings, especially in our public housing portfolio. The buildings tend to be quite old, And so we have found that we have an opportunity to do a better job to reduce carbon emissions through our decarbonization efforts. And we are working in collaboration with the U.S. Department of Energy and other agencies to focus more on our decarbonization efforts. And then the third goal is to pursue environmental justice. As I mentioned before, we need to empower communities in such a way that when a disaster strikes, or even before a disaster strikes, that we are building community resilient neighborhoods, and we are focusing on improving access and equity in everything that we do and in our programs, and creating healthy housing as well. Next slide. So one of our major programs is the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, or CDBG-DR program, which I think a lot of people are very familiar with. CDBG-DR, or we lovingly call Disaster Recovery Program, provides flexible grants to help cities, counties, states recover from declared disasters. And Congress essentially appropriates additional funding under the Disaster Recovery Program, which provides more flexibility for communities that are greatly affected from, or continue to be affected by recurrent disaster tragedies. The DR program focuses on long-term recovery efforts to help communities and neighborhoods that otherwise might not have the funding or resources to address disaster-related or climate-related issues. And under the DR program, funds can be used to restore infrastructure or built environment, to build new housing, for housing recovery, economic development, and mitigation activities. Next slide. There's another program under the Community Development Block Grant Program. It's called CDBG Disaster Mitigation. And the CDBG Mitigation Program provides a unique opportunity for grantees to use assistance in areas impacted by recent disasters to address current and future risks from national disasters and prepare communities in the future as well. HUD has allocated more than $16 billion in mitigation funds for qualifying disasters in 2015 through 2018. And the program defines disaster mitigation activities that increase resilience to disasters and reduce or eliminate the long-term risks and impacts involved in disaster events, including the loss of life, injury, damage to, and loss of property. And in this case, housing is considered among those losses. Next slide. So the Community Development Block Grant programs help move the administration's climate and equity goals forward. And in fact, the CDBG-DR program in general and the CDBG mitigation grants allows our nation's communities to build back better after disasters, especially for low-income residents, and proactively implement innovative climate adaptation solutions that will make their communities more resilient in the future. That includes site planning for disaster preparedness. And our focus has been on disaster preparedness. So we want to make sure these communities are resilient before a disaster strikes and not wait till after a disaster hits and destroys lives. Next slide. So we looked at Puerto Rico, which is where we're doing a lot of our work, and a lot of our dollars, CDBG mitigation funds have been directed to since Hurricane Maria hit in 2017. The focus of the work that we're doing in Puerto Rico includes community and energy and water resilience installation program. On the single family level, this program installs photovoltaic systems, solar generators, battery storage, and capacities aligned with household needs, including consideration of critical medical needs. It also includes an incentive program that will cover up to $20,000 or a designated percentage of household project costs to enable the installation of renewable, reliable, resilient energy systems. That includes solar. It includes it also includes a grid system, a minor grid system, energy grid system, and improvements to that. And I mentioned energy storage as well. Next slide. So the work that I do in the Office of Policy Development Research includes our learning agenda, which is a very dynamic document. And I urge all those who are interested in our research focus to look to the learning agenda, because there you will find a lot of the department's priorities in terms of what we're looking for in our research and improving data and analysis and helping communities and helping our grantees and the public at large understand where we need to direct our resources to improve outcomes that affect communities when a disaster hits. The learning agenda also includes a focus on building technologies that we think will help fortify housing such that when a disaster does hit, we have resilient housing and we can quickly leverage and maneuver families that need to be located or relocated from the disaster site and housed quickly and efficiently without disruption in people's lives. So I look to the research, the learning agenda research for opportunities to contribute to that agenda. And again, I said that this is a dynamic document, so we're always looking for ideas for our agenda. Next slide. So I'll mention some of these. So building tech studies that focus on community resilient housing. We are working with Alaska's Nome or Inuit community. In fact, we just returned from Alaska a couple of weeks ago. This is a demonstration of 3D concrete printing for affordable housing for Alaska's indigenous population. This is looking more at building materials that are more environmentally friendly. So the non-concrete types of resource or building materials that we think are resilient, but also are not impactful against environmental friendly and against our goals to use more environmentally friendly and sustainable materials in our buildings. Other projects that we're looking at, another 3D concrete printing project, which focuses on seismic regions in the United States, in the lower 48. We're looking at better construction methods and better construction materials to go into affordable housing projects. And this looks more into the multifamily space rather than the single family space. And finally, another example of a research project is focusing on improving mass timber in multifamily housing technologies, because we think that mass timber is cheaper. So therefore, when we're building affordable housing, we're using materials that are resilient, but are affordable as well, and that we can build housing relatively quickly with cross-laminated timber and other mass timber systems. Next slide. Another case study that we are looking at is called the FIAS Passive House Retrofit. This house is located in Washington, D.C. It's located in the Weinberg Commons Passive House. This is an area in Northwest Washington, D.C. Just a few features of this passive house. It is built to the Passive House Standard. That is the most stringent standard that you can find in the country. We are moving towards energy efficiency, net zero energy efficiency, I should say, which includes advanced techniques such as insulation, triple glazed windows, and a mechanical ventilation system with heat recovery. And also looks at or includes renewable energy integration in that project, and focuses on airtight housing envelopes so that we can control indoor air quality more efficiently. Next slide. Some other features, indoor air quality, looking at thermal comfort, focusing on occupant comfort by maintaining a stable and comfortable indoor air climate, the use of sustainable materials, improving water efficiency, and including in community integration in the neighborhood. So it's not just about the house, it's about building a more resilient community around the house. And I think that as we continue to work on this case study, would love to have people come and visit. Next slide. So I just want to mention quickly some policies and initiatives that are available. Under the initiatives, we have what's called energy performance contracting, and that's mainly focused on public housing and reducing our energy or improving energy efficiency in our public housing stock. There's something called the rate reduction incentive, which is an incentive to achieve rate reduction by making improvements, energy efficient improvements to housing. It also includes shallow and more advanced retrofit techniques and incorporating those techniques primarily in older public housing, but also some multifamily housing developments as well. There's other incentives that we have, the guidance on solar, looking at improving solar installation, addressing the split incentive because we subsidize a lot of our energy efficiency in public housing and in some multifamily housing. It presents a non-incentive for tenants to improve energy usage behavior. So we want to provide more of a reason for people to change their behavior. Even marginal changes in energy consumption behavior makes all the difference. And then I also want to just quickly talk about the Inflation Reduction Act and some of our programs under that. There's a Solar for All that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has another program. Our program focuses on housing, more specifically public housing and multifamily housing. Then there is the Green Resilient and Retrofit program, which focuses on multifamily housing. And there is a retrofit piece that provides grantees the opportunity to make physical improvements to multifamily developments. And then there is a resiliency piece, which focuses on decarbonization efforts in multifamily housing. Next slide. There's another program called the Clean Energy Ready Homes program, which focuses on the expansion of EV chargers and improving access to EV chargers, efficient Energy Star certified EV chargers. It's also promotes ready for solar and in electrification. So improving our electrification in buildings is very important for us because, again, these buildings in our HUD portfolio are very old and emit a lot of our carbon. And so we are trying to find better ways to incorporate these innovative practices in our programs. The Green Mortgage Insurance Premium as well is another incentive program for addressing or at least incentivizing mortgage insurance for owners and for managers of multifamily housing developments. Next slide. Yes, and our work on utility benchmarking is going to be key under the Green, Resilient, and Retrofit program. We are going to be working with our friends over at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, utilizing their portfolio manager to help us in getting better data on our utilities and helping us work through the benchmarking process. And there are many, many benefits in the multifamily space in particular. And that is making better use of data by identifying billing errors, informing retrofit planning or doing better on the retrofit plans, parts, improvements in property operations, and helping with funding providers and governing agencies. Next slide. I mentioned Puerto Rico earlier. One of the initiatives that we're working on in Puerto Rico is reestablishing the microgrid, right? Improving the microgrid. And so that includes small scale electricity generating networks connected to consumers to an electricity supply system that is centralized. It also includes essential building blocks for future electricity delivery systems. So better ways to kind of move, or better ways to work with electricity and deliver it more efficiently. Supporting resilience, decarbonization, and affordability, of course. And then I mentioned earlier, the energy storage is a key here. The next time, hopefully won't be any next time, but in case of a disaster attack, one of the disadvantages that Puerto Rico had was that the energy storage systems were not protected. So we are focusing on doing a better job of building more efficient energy storage systems that protect in cases of a climate disaster. Next slide. This includes virtual power plants as well. I won't get into much here, but I will say that we're doing more work around virtual power plants because we think that that is the future. And I think getting creative and innovative with how we build and protect these plants are going to be very key in the future, especially as we continue to experience climate disaster events. Next slide. I mentioned Puerto Rico before, but I'll just say really quickly that we continue to explore more localized power solutions rather than focusing on sort of generating information from the upper 48. Puerto Rico has a specific issue that is localized, and so it's cheaper or more efficient and more affordable to look for localized solutions to energy, and also in support of the microgrid system. Next slide. So building climate resilient communities is our focus today. And I just want to point you to a few resources that we have unveiled in the Office of Policy Development and Research. We just released Designing for Natural Hazard series. This is a 5-volume practical guide to assist builders and developers in designing and constructing residential buildings in a manner that would improve resilience to protect against natural hazards. And when I say natural hazards, I mean wind events, fire events, tornadoes, etc. So we have this guide, we produced this guide to ensure that there are some there's some rules, or there's some guidance in place for those who are building in these climates to help sort of navigate when they are building their projects. The Community Resilience Planning for Disaster Recovery. This is a report that we work with the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Basically, it's a case study, essentially, to improve climate goals in collaboration with HUD and in collaboration with NOAA and with NIST, and providing guidance and planning for communities that are seeking to build more resilient communities and plan for disaster events. And then coming soon is our Site Planning for Disaster Mitigation Guidebook. This is a discussion on the importance of topics including wetland mitigation, erosion control, storm damage, accessibility, and asphalt paving, and more. To help prepare our communities for disaster events, and not after a disaster strikes. Next. I want to mention our Built for the Future Opportunities for Investment program that was recently announced. And this is a holistic approach to creating a resilient community. Next slide. So the goal here is to enable and encourage HUD program participants to use funding opportunities that increase climate resiliency and promote sustainable environments that decrease carbon emissions. This program connects HUD with participants from other relevant agencies, including EPA, DOE, Treasury, USDA, and FEMA. Our goal here is to foster collaboration between local program participants and stakeholders, and housing adjacent state offices to improve community resilience and to create more community resilient hubs. That's one of the goals. Next slide. So I want to mention that we just held our innovative housing showcase back in June, which highlights resilient housing and construction materials and design. We hold a showcase every year on the National Mall where we feature resilient construction practices, innovative housing design, innovative building materials, and more energy efficient practices and policies in housing and community development. This year was the most successful showcase we've had thus far. It is the 4th time we've held the showcase, and we're planning for the next one for next summer. Next slide. I also want to mention quickly the Better Climate Challenge, that we have. The goal here is to reduce operational carbon emissions of at least 50% within 10 years. And we are working with our stakeholder groups and others around the country to promote better buildings with the less amount of carbonation possible. And our major partner here is the U.S. Department of Energy, which we're doing a lot of work with to reduce carbon. Next slide. All right, so here are some resources that I have for you. I mentioned our learning agenda, our Innovative Housing Showcase, the Climate Action Plan, the Build for the Future program, and the HUD Better Buildings Challenge program. There are many other initiatives that we have underway, including our Green, Resilient, and Retrofit program that I don't have listed here. But I think we're going to make these slides available for people who want to have access to these resources. And I thank you very, very much for your time.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, aloha and mahalo to Ramona and to Miku and Serene and all of the great humans that took the time today to go ahead and learn a little bit deeper around where and how resilient investments can come together and how collectively we are really working together to solution. A big part of what I do, my name is Michelle Beasley. I am with FEMA Region 9. I deploy as a federal disaster recovery officer, and I also lead an interagency recovery coordination team. What that really means in a nutshell is when FEMA programming can't always fill the gap, my team gets to be very resourceful in learning where and how we can partner with other federal agencies to connect them to state and local communities in order to help build back better. Next slide. So a little bit about what we are going to talk about today is really where and how my group at least likes to think about the holistic approach to resilience and where different programs both within FEMA and outside of FEMA can help lean in. A lot of that really is thinking about data and definitions and eligibility when you all are writing grants or when you're partnering or when you're learning to determine where you fit into this ecosystem of resilience. And so I'm going to just sort of talk a little bit about that and we'll move forward. Next slide, please. So essentially, building resilience takes a holistic approach. Next slide. And what that means from an internal FEMA perspective is we really have 4 different departments that help lead different programming implementations, both before, during, and after disasters. That includes the response, the recovery, the mitigation, and preparedness. And a lot of times the IRC group will, for example, in a disaster recovery, work with emergency operations. We'll work with various different agencies across both federal and local communities for support functions. We lean in with some of the resilient planning and also with ideas on critical infrastructure and how to think about all of those various different components within that whole entire ecosystem. Next slide. Keep going. Sorry, there's a lot of different, and so here we are. The IRC particularly works within that recovery support function space. So we do work with HUD. We work with our friends, the Army Corps of Engineers, and infrastructure, HHS with Health and Social Services, Natural and Cultural Resources will work with the Department of Interior, Department of Energy, or EPA or what have you. And we are also very interested in the community planning, capacity building, and economic recovery that we're able to lean in with our partners such as EDA. Next slide. Next slide. So a big part of thinking about resilience is actually looking at where and how there have been different guides or frameworks that have been put out there around resilience. And while I recognize that this is the third year that this virtual conference has been happening around resilience hubs, it has taken about 3 years for our national resilience guidance to be published, which it is published, hallelujah. And it really does lay out a vision of resilience. And the reason why I lean into this is because how we define resilience is really going to be up to the community, guaranteed. How you get investments into resilience is going to be how you link your definition of resilience to the definition that many of the organizations or foundations or federal agencies might be using. So I use that as a reference to really think about where and how your concept of resilience might be leaning into a larger framework. Next slide. And it always begs me to ask the question, is there even one definition of resilience? And I'm going to say absolutely not. Resilience is going to look and feel and mean differently to everybody. However, from a FEMA perspective, if you're looking to tap into where your ecosystem, your project, your community endeavor or initiative lies, we see resilience as the ability to prepare for threats and hazards, adapt to changing conditions, and withstand and recover rapidly from disasters. And so that's the definition that FEMA uses. And one of the things that I've learned is every agency, every organization has a different twist to this. Next slide. So what that means is, how are we linking this national guidance around resilience to some of the programming that's coming out? And some of the programming within FEMA includes Community Disaster Resilience Zones Act. So this act was passed in 2022. And it was passed by Congress to essentially allow FEMA to increase the federal cost share up to 90% to eligible building resilient infrastructure and community projects that fall within or primarily benefit a designated community disaster resilience zone. I bring this up because it's a framework by which you can begin to understand, do we as a community fall into this definition? And if we're building a resilience hub, can we take advantage of these different components to help us get more of our investment back into the bones of whatever it is that you all are trying to build in your own hubs? Next slide. So if you add the community disaster resilience zones together, essentially they're using a lot of data that comes from the National Risk Index and then also EPA's environmental justice screening tool. And that screening tool was a set of analyses that pulled together to really look at what I'm going to call disadvantaged communities. And if you begin to bring these different data sets together, you begin to build a picture. Next slide. So the picture that I had begun to work with my team, and I'm really fortunate because I have a few folks that are specialized in data analytics and geospatial mapping, and we work with data all the time. And one of the things that we learned during the COVID days is that the where and how we pull different data sources can really be put onto a map and really begin to build a story. And the story that I want to build for you all is what happens when you begin to layer some of these designated areas that different agencies have designated, and what happens when you put it together and then you actually locate your resilience hubs within that framework. So this picture that you see up on the screen is an example of Hawaii, the Big Island, and where a community disaster resilience zone has been acknowledged on the island where that lives. We also added a couple of other layers of data, disadvantaged, and then also we were able to select qualified opportunity zones, which I believe is something that both HUD and EDA come together on with regards to how to economically build in disadvantaged communities. So when thinking about resilience hubs frameworks, where and how are you located? Where and how are you helping to benefit certain key communities that maybe don't have resources? So if you go to the next slide, what we did was an experimental map to mock up what it would look like to put the bipartisan infrastructure bill funding that we know has been designated and obligated out into Hawaii, and additionally the Infrastructure Reduction Act funding. And we know that not all of it has been obligated. We know that there's still a lot more of the funding that folks can access, but if we could go ahead and use data points that showcase where this has begun happening in Hawaii, what that would look like with some other data layers and what that looks like with communities at risk. So next slide. And next slide. Essentially, the Investing in America webpage, I'm going to say, is a page that's been hosted by the White House. And if you don't know about it, I'm going to encourage everybody to go ahead and go to this site because it's really interesting. What they've been doing here is they have been tracking both the public investments and the private investments that have been coming out from the bipartisan infrastructure bill and also from the Inflation Reduction Act. And they've been mapping that to showcase where that investment is actually occurring within the United States. Also out into the islands in the Pacific, and then our territories down in the Virgin Islands in Puerto Rico. So what we did was we said, what does that look like? Next slide. And what we leaned into is we recognized that there is a whole lot of data that they were pulling to showcase where obligated investments have been made, both with the American Rescue Plan, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS for America, and the list continues. When you go to this page, you're going to be able to look at the data, and you're also going to be able to pull that data yourself so that then you can go ahead and begin to build your own strategy around those investments and where your own project might be able to benefit or perhaps be what I'm going to call mutually beneficial with that investment. So next slide. And so my key question here when I was asking my team to go ahead and help build out this mock-up was, are there opportunities that can be leveraged with both the bill investments and the IRA investments, along with all of the other programming and resources to support resilient communities? When we map that on the Hawaiian Islands, we essentially were able to pull IRA data, the bill data. We actually used the Big Island as a model for resilience hubs and the data that we pulled was from the Department of Homeland Security, which has been tracking resilience hubs across the country. We also were really interested in vulnerable places where there is low density, high density, and then also where that community disaster resilience zone might be obligated in order to really begin to showcase where funding, investment, projects can really help lift community. And so next slide. One of the things that we found in this is we were able to pull the data and look to see that right now there are a grand total of 308 projects that are IRA or our bill and a few other the key acts that were passed. And we were able to identify and pinpoint where those projects are happening across all of the islands. We were also able to see where and how much money has been invested. And I think that this is an important point because it'll be really interesting as a baseline to see where is the good, where is the impact of this. Initially, due to the bill, transportation, DOT, they got a lot of money. They were able to really help lean in with our roads and our bridges and even the vehicles that act as the transportation modules to help people get from one place to another, public transit, etc. So 61% of a lot of these Investing in America projects were transportation projects across the board in Hawaii. Additionally, we saw that 16% were really designated as quote unquote resilience projects, receiving about 5.3% of the total funding. Now, this is always going to be a moving target. This was a point in time that we were able to map. I believe the newest data set had come out on June 11th of this year, and it looks like they update the data every 3 months. So we expect these numbers to be changing. But we found this really interesting. So if you go to the next slide. What we decided to continue to look at is if you look at the counties, of which there are 4 counties according to the census in Hawaii. Honolulu clearly has a large pool of the IRA and bill investments. And so if you look at what that looks like, 58% of all the total projects so far as of June were really focused on that particular area, and they've gotten the bulk of a lot of the funding. And then the remaining islands have really been help picking up those pieces. So 42% of the remainder projects and a smaller portion of the funding has been awarded. Next slide. If I look at Big Island, this is where the mock-up begins to get a little bit more interesting. And the reason why I point this out is because I think layers of data can really help build a picture of where investments are being made, maybe where they're not being made, maybe where a gap can be filled, maybe understanding who the target community is, and then better understanding where and how programs that are being implemented on the ground can do better. So what you're seeing here is the symbology isn't super clear here, but what you're seeing is you have these little pins, and we are going to try to make this a more interactive map so that we can host it online if that's something that folks would be interested in. And then you would be able to hover around these little points to know, is this a transportation project? Is it a resilience project? Is it, how is it being labeled? Additionally, you'd be able to pinpoint, oh, this is a resilience hub. Wow, okay, they're serving a low density, vulnerable place. And wow, there's some kind of bill funding that's happening right now. So maybe that's a transportation project. And maybe there's a way to connect that transportation project to the resilience hub. Or maybe there's a way to go ahead and take a look at the higher densities and to say, what is unique about each of these different resilience hubs on the Big Island? How are we connecting to IRA funding? How is that IRA funding connected to these resilience hubs? Where are their partnership opportunities? So again, this is a story that you can begin to pull together to really better understand gaps, opportunities, challenges, networks that you can lean into, and really to help build out that, as I said in the beginning, a very holistic community. Next slide. So in this Investing in America data for Hawaii County, we saw that, Hawaii County received 18% of the total projects across the board. Transportation, again, is right now what we're seeing as a trend. The area that has obligated the most investment to a lot of these key projects, both in the county and also across Hawaii. So 65% of the total projects that you see are transportation. It is taking up a bulk of the total funding. We expect all of these numbers to grow and to also diversify, and that resilience is actually 7.4% of that. So again, it makes an interesting story to see where the investment is falling and where and how we're leaning in collectively together to help fill the gaps. Next slide. Next slide. Perfect. So investing in America, oh, whoops, go back one. Sorry, we got too quick to the ball. So again, sort of an overall summary around this is 43% of vulnerable places that we identified in Hawaii County were receiving some kind of project funding or investment. Additionally, there are approximately, and I think this number is always changing a little bit, 35 identified resilience hubs, at least that's what we were able to pull from the Department of Homeland Security Resilience Hub site. And my question is, how does resilience grow in Hawaii, especially within vulnerable populations, if these communities have both resilience hubs and the IRA and bill investments? I'd be really curious to see what kinds of responses and answers we get. Moving on to the next slide. Next slide. So then if you think about these maps and we weave together additional resources for resilience, what might that look like? So when I think about that, other additional resources, it's critical infrastructure, it's climate, it's health solutions. All of these are inextricably linked to one another when achieving equity and resilience work. Next slide. An example of this is a nonprofit called Project Drawdown. So Project Drawdown is a really what I'm going to call a repository hub of all of the many different solutions that are happening for a climate change world. And one area of that focus is the community stories. Some of the community stories are actually showcasing resilience hubs. And in this case, we have a story that comes out of Louisiana and New Orleans of Denise Williams, who really jump-started the idea of resilient cities. And resilient cities, one of the projects that they actually jump-started as a result of Katrina and the multiple disasters that happened thereafter in Louisiana and New Orleans, was this thing called Get Lit, Stay Lit. And Get Lit, Stay Lit really showcases where they were building what I'm going to call micro-resilience hubs in restaurants. And that restaurants would be the space and the place for the community to come in and be able to get all of the many different resources that they needed to keep going, both during the disaster and after the disaster. But what's really cool about this use case is that they've linked this use case to some of the key solutions that were put into place. And a big solution around this restaurant micro-resilience hub grid was electricity. Folks need electricity. And so they were able to utilize a restaurant network to be able to provide folks with power, provide folks with the ability to put solar panels on these restaurants so that they could go ahead and help lean in on the community. And what this Project Drawdown has done is they've actually made connections between real solutions and into the community around resilience hubs, which I think is amazing. Next slide. Additionally, there is currently right now, I think it's coming up at the end of September, a huge, gigantic conference that's going to be taking place in New York for an entire week. And I think it's called Climate New York. It's being run by another nonprofit, international nonprofit organization called Climate Works. And Climate Works brings in the private investors, they bring in the philanthropists, they bring in venture capitalists, they bring in federal agencies, they bring in local communities, they bring in all of the practitioners, entrepreneurs, everyone that you could think of in the community that is really helping to showcase how to help lean in from both an intersectoral perspective and then also from a connectivity perspective around climate change and solutioning for that. I bring it to your attention because there are some virtual events that are going to be possible for you to potentially lean in. And they're really providing a series of different solutionings for how resilience hubs, communities, agencies can lean in together to effectively create a stronger, more resilient world. Next slide. Additionally, if we think about leveraging resilient investments, I always think about broadband. I know that many of you are familiar with a lot of the digital equity work that is happening across Hawaii. A big shout out to the Hawaii Hui and broadband Hui that has really been pulling a lot of those pieces together. What I want to say here is that has provided a lot of funding right now to help kind of build together this interconnectivity between things like health, between infrastructure, between communications, school, work, the whole shebang. And when you go to the next slide, one of the things that my team was also doing was really working with a variety of different Hawaii partners to focus in on telehealth access points. The reason I bring this up is because it's another frame. So if we look at the bill and we look at the IRA investments that are being made and we connect that to resilience hubs, how do we also connect that to telehealth? And how do we connect that to the transportation investments that are happening? So if there is transportation investments happening that allow people to be able to map out where their closest telehealth access point is, and let's say it's a resilience hub, then essentially they're going to be going to a resilience hub in order to have a telemedicine appointment. I think it's a really interesting idea to go ahead and say, wow, here's how we can use some of this funding and investment for a different thing and really help lean and build our own project forward. Next slide. Additionally, there are drawdown solutions libraries. So if you're really trying to figure out how do we make our resilience hub unique to our community needs, this drawdown solutions library kind of gives you the white book study of all the many different solutions that are possible. And then it might help with the visioning and the ideation and or the concrete technical pieces that you might need in order to begin to jumpstart your own idea. Next slide. And what I did was I put some FEMA resilience resources up here. And if we go to the next slide, some of those additional resilience resources, the Investing in America, DHS Resilience Hub Finder, Project Drawdown, and some of the interesting work that's coming out of Climate Week. And with that, I just want to say thank you very much, deep mahalo, and looking forward to the conversation. Thanks. And I'm going to pass the baton over to Sharon Bowen, who I believe is with EPA Region 9.
Hi, just a sound check. I think my mic is unmuted. Okay. So hi, I'm Sharon Bowen. I work in the EPA San Francisco office in the Air and Radiation Division. I spend about half of my time managing grants and the other half doing outreach and coordination for Inflation Reduction Act funding. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm going to primarily talk about available funding opportunities and engagement opportunities in grant programs that EPA is involved in. I think you've heard a lot about FEMA and HUD, and they've given you some of the background. And so I'll try to kind of move quickly through some of the background slides. So you can go to the next slide. This is an overview of the IRA goals, which you've kind of already heard, but this gives you sort of the EPA totals for comparison. Under the Inflation Reduction Act, we received $41.5 billion in federal funding, mostly for new and existing grant programs. And just to put that into context, EPA normally, our annual budget is under $10 billion. So that's for all 10 regions and all of our air, water, and land programs. So it's quite a lot more money than we're used to managing. Okay, next slide. So this is a little bit more of the breakdown to show you where EPA falls in among the agencies we've been working with. We are the top agency for receiving IRA funding, and you know, the major crux of the Inflation Reduction Act was in tax credits. Next slide. So these are the main programs that received funding, the $41.5 billion in appropriations. And most of these programs, with the exception of one, the Environmental Justice Program, Block Grants, which we're going to talk about, most of them have closed, the opportunities have closed. But there are things to talk about in a few of them that may be of interest to folks who are looking for community engagement opportunities and sub-award funding. So stay tuned. Okay, next slide. So you may have heard about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. It's the largest IRA program. It was at the top of the list of EPA funded programs. It's a brand new program, and it's actually 3 programs, mainly with the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and delivering those benefits to low-income disadvantaged communities. Those 3 opportunities have closed, but they have important engagement opportunities I'm going to talk about on the next slide. So go ahead. Okay, so here are the 3 programs broken down, and you can look at them on the EPA website, which is linked. All of the recipients of these fundings have work plans available online, and so you can link directly to the existing programs' websites to see where they're at in terms of rolling out funding. So this first one, the National Clean Investment Fund, we funded 3 national nonprofits that are set up to fund either new or existing green banks in partnership with investors, CBOs, and others to deploy renewable energy projects. So 40% of those projects will be in low-income disadvantaged communities. And then the next program, the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator, funded 5 nonprofits that will be working fully with low-income disadvantaged communities to provide both technical assistance services and actual project funding. And some of that funding will come in the form of subawards to partners that are identified usually by a competitive process. So those most likely have not been announced yet. I haven't seen any that have been made available, but it's the awards were most recently made, like within the last month, and the organizations are working on work plans to get out more opportunities for subaward and other technical assistance to communities especially low-income disadvantaged communities. And then the third program you're going to hear a little bit more about in a minute, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. It's called Solar for All, and Hawaii Green Infrastructure Authority will be talking about their $62 million grant. This is for deployment of residential rooftop solar. And there's another grantee. There's multiple grantees across the U.S., but I highlighted the 2 that have coverage for Hawaii. So Hawaii Green Infrastructure Authority and also Inclusive Prosperity Capital received $249 million for projects in multiple states, including Hawaii. So you might want to take a look at that one. Those selectees are all linked on this presentation, which I think is being shared with you. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we're going to move. This presentation used to have a lot more programs, but since they've closed, I tried to highlight just mainly the ones that have opportunities available that you might want to look into. So we're moving straight to the environmental justice programs. And this first one that I'm talking about is the Grantmaker program. And similar to what I just talked about with Clean Communities Investment Accelerator, this program is an award to a large nonprofit that then creates sub-award opportunities for community-based organizations. So nationwide, we awarded 11 grant makers, but in EPA Region 9, so EPA Region 9 covers California, Arizona, Hawaii, Nevada, and the Pacific Islands. So we have 2 grant makers. Those are the Social and Environmental Entrepreneur and Climate Justice Alliance. If you want to go to the next slide, there's links to both of those. And sorry, I thought I edited this slide. So mostly pay attention to the blue part on this slide. We expect the sub-grant notice of funding opportunity hopefully by the end of the year, and you can go to these 2 websites to find those NOFOs. The eligibility of projects is very broad for this. It's basically anything you can think of in terms of environmental justice, resilience, climate action, and even just technical assistance to communities. So you definitely take a look at those if you're looking for open funding opportunities. Okay, next slide. This is actually not a grant program, but it's another resource that may be of interest to folks who are seeking funding or maybe have funding and need assistance in managing it. It's called the Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Center. They're also called TICTACs. The TCTS acronym that we love has been morphed into TICTACs. And you can receive assistance for anybody from a community, residents, nonprofit, grassroots organization, state and local entity, or tribal entity can receive assistance. So next slide, I'll show you which ones you can, or how to access these organizations. Next slide. Okay, so our 2 in EPA Region 9 are the Western Environmental Science Technical Assistance Center for Environmental Justice, and you can see the QR code there at the right, and a Center for Community, Energy, and Environmental Justice. There's also a QR code there. Next slide. My colleagues in the Environmental Justice Program asked me to put this slide on here. It's brand new. One of the Thriving Community Technical Assistance Centers has started a Community Champions program. It's a paid 12-month program, and you can join as a cohort member from Arizona, California, Hawaii, Nevada, and the U.S. affiliated Pacific Islands to build capacity, to help with capacity building, leadership training, and peer learning support. Okay, next slide. And then this is my last funding opportunity that I have to talk about, which is a little bit sad because we've been talking about open funding opportunities for almost 2 years now. And this is the last one that I have that's open. And it's open until, I thought the date was on here, but it's open until November. And it's been open on a rolling basis for environmental justice communities to access funding. Now, I think the next slide will show that the environmental justice, you can go to the next slide, please. It shows, yeah, so in order to be eligible, it needs to be a partnership between local government and a community-based nonprofit. That's a little different than most of our previous grant programs. And again, this is a really broad eligibility of projects kind of grant, where you can fund anything from air quality monitoring, water quality monitoring, to technical assistance. And the list, which I already showed on the previous slide, is long and broad. But the most important part is that there's a partnership between the government and the CBO. Okay, next slide. I think some of these resources may have already been mentioned, but they're here again. The White House has an Inflation Reduction Act guidebook for many other of the open resources, open funding opportunities, if there are any left in other agencies. EPA has IRA, an IRA page, and the second one, resources to help communities. The Community Equity Resiliency Resource Guide has a lot of great information on it for the stuff that you've been talking about in the previous slides. And then if you are an EPA applicant or grantee, this EPA grants resources link is really important. We have tons of great resources for learning how to apply for grants and learning how to manage grants once you get one. Okay, so I rushed through that because I know we're a little bit behind. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat and I will try to respond. Thank you. I think the last slide is just my contact info. If you want to go to the next one. Yeah, that's my contact information. Thank you.
Okay, I think I'm up. The next slide, please. Mahalo, Sharon. Lots of great information from all the speakers. I'm writing down a lot of notes. Next slide, please. The Hawaii Green Infrastructure Authority, also known as Hawaii's Green Bank, was constituted in 2014 to provide inclusive financing to underserved ratepayers unable to get financing at reasonable rates and terms. Up until now, most people have not heard of a securitized bond. However, following the wildfires, and especially during this past legislative session, there was a lot of buzz on the power of securitization to lower the cost of capital. But in 2014, 10 years ago, DBED used this tried and true financing mechanism that was typically used to rescue stranded utility assets to instead capitalize our loan fund. Our mandate was to provide loans to ratepayers that banks and credit unions felt a little bit uncomfortable lending to, while stimulating private investments into our financing and reaching new markets. What a tall order, but the only way we could accomplish this was to leverage an innovative financing mechanisms to mitigate risk. Next slide, please. As of June 30th, our green financing programs have created or retained almost 1,500 jobs, generated almost 18 million in state tax revenues, and have an economic multiplier impact of over $306 million. And thanks to Melissa and Huanani Partners, as mentioned earlier, HGIA was awarded $62.5 million from the EPA that we expect to start deploying early next year when the funds become available for rooftop and community solar projects benefiting low-income households and disadvantaged communities. Next slide, please. So our Green Energy Money Saver financing program eliminates all credit barriers. We don't rely on credit scores or do debt to income ratios to qualify for loans. There are only two criteria to qualify. First, you need to be an underserved ratepayer, and we define them as low or moderate income homeowners, renters, 43% of our household rents in Hawaii, a nonprofit or a small business as defined as by the Small Business Administration. And secondly, we need to be able to estimate an electric utility bill savings after the solar is installed, including our loan repayment or power purchase agreement payments, ranging between 5 to 20%, depending on the number of disconnection notices received. The loan is tied to the obligation is tied to the utility meter, which allows for transfer from tenant to tenant, and payments are made through the HECO, MECO, or HELCO utility bills. Next slide, please. Here's an example of a nonprofit saving over $2,000 a month or 38% on their electric utility bill after the installation of solar. Next slide, please. While we have not yet financed any resiliency hubs, I'm looking forward to that, we did finance the Kahu'iki Village microgrid, where previously homeless families moved into their new homes in January of 2018. Due to complications of the location of the property, they had to go under a bridge and over some land and water. The utility was not able to connect the project to the electric grid until June of 2018. So therefore, for the first 6 months, this housing project was not grid connected and residents did not even realize it. This is a true testament to the power and resiliency of microgrids. Next slide, please. On May 30th, Governor Green signed Act 41, the CPACER bill, into law. Next slide, please. CPACER, which stands for Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy and Resiliency, provides non-traditional financing for commercial properties, including multifamily projects, agricultural properties, condominium associations, and nonprofit-owned commercial properties. Instead of a mortgage, CPACER financing is secured by a voluntary governmental lien and assessment. Because this mitigates lender risk, it allows lenders to extend the loan term to the life of the equipment being financed. So where it might typically for a lender be a 5, 7, or 10-year loan, CPACE loans could go up to 30 years. Next slide, please. CPACER does not finance everything, only qualifying improvements such as solar PV, EV charging stations, water conservation measures, and resiliency measures like fire suppression system, hurricane windows, and other retrofits that are fixed to and harden a building. Next slide, please. As mentioned, the way CPACER unlocks capital is through a voluntary governmental lien. This slide shows the triangle reflecting risk. The lowest risk is at the top of the triangle. Property taxes will always be on the top, followed by the CPACER lien, and then the first mortgage, second mortgage, and equipment lien. As you go down the triangle, the risk gets higher. When the risk gets higher, the rates go a little bit higher and the terms get shorter. Because of the lien position, we're above first mortgages or second mortgages, lender consent is required if you have an existing mortgage, but this allows the CPACE lender to stretch out the loan term to bring down the required payment. Our CPACER financing program launched statewide on July 1st, and I'm going to take us to the next slide and call up Melissa Unimori-Hamp for the last presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gwen. Appreciate it. Yep, go to the next slide. Just introduction. So again, Melissa Unimori-Hamp with Skog, Rasmussen, coming in from Maui. I'm really grateful for all of our knowledgeable speakers. I'm sure we've learned a lot from their insights, and I, for one, really look forward to taking a lot of it into the work I do with federal grants. So I know we're limited on time, so I'm going to talk fast. So definitely put things in the chat if you have questions. But so, all this includes understanding that there are things everyone is coming up with to help our projects and organizations here in Hawaii be more ready to pursue grants, and in a way that really caretakes our disadvantaged communities and looks forward to a more climate resilient future together. So I'm taking away that entities are continually looking at new resources to provide us, such as you saw the Bill and IRA project map, Community Disaster Resilience Zones viewer Michelle told us about, HUD's Natural Hazards Guide and case studies shared by Regina, and the reports and articles Emily mentioned out of the Fed. They're also open to hearing new ideas from us to add to these databases, so such as through HUD's dynamic learning agenda. And they're willing to talk about potential projects and help shape them, as FEMA mentioned. And then hearing from Gwen, of course, the federal funding is flowing. And with everyone's help, it will make it to the communities that really need it the most. So this is a great opportunity to really think about how to take advantage of all this openness and availability of resources. So what I'm going to be doing today, and you go to the next slide, is showing various tools in a sort of checklist for your grant pursuit. So for those of you who have written and secured federal grants, it's not a small feat to craft them in a compelling way that will translate your needs and drill down into exactly what you will do with the award. So it takes effort, but opportunity plus effort equals resources. So know this, as I've been involved in more than 450 grant submissions, including the one that Gwen talked about, that was successful. And these have all been really hopeful and optimistic asks of the funding universe. So several tapping some of the funding opportunities you heard about today. And what I'll convey is an approach to strategically pursue funding in sort of a step-by-step manner. Next slide, please. So I have a number of slides and you're going to get them, but given the time we have left, I won't cover all of them. Rather, I put them together so you can walk away with at least some breadcrumbs down the figurative path to grant funding. A lot of this I'll base on a very detailed guide that it was my privilege to create, along with the team led by the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, or USDN, as was mentioned earlier. And so for those of you who aren't familiar, this is a national nonprofit that has more than 300 cities and counties across the US and Canada in its network, including all of the counties here in Hawaii. So some of you may already be familiar with their dedicated work in resilience hubs, and I will put links to both the guide And the Resilience Hub page in the chat. Give me a second on that second one. You can go to the next slide. In the meantime, okay, next slide, please. So first thing to consider in the grant seeking process is one suggested approach right from that seeking federal funding guide. So for those of you who are more used to the hair on fire way of pursuing grants, maybe you're going after it a week or two before the deadline. This really shows the ideal process in a much longer continuum with several steps that can occur before the funding announcement is identified or even hits the street. So what this is conveying is that to have a truly compelling application that can compete well on the national level, you really need to think more about a process that spans from 9 months to a year or even more if possible. Okay, so next slide. So in this phase of project ideation, I usually do an hour-long training on this. I'm not going to do that here, but it speaks to the logic model, which several of us in the grant writing space employ as a written way to coalesce thoughts about a project and to make sure it hangs together. So let me skip to the next slide so you can see how this model plays out. Go there. So this is a Resilience Hubs example and specific. So if we go from broad to specific, I like to start at the right side. Ultimately, we want our hub to produce a more resilient community with a more educated and empowered citizenry through a model that could be replicated elsewhere. And this is a model that I worked on with one of the East Coast USDN participants, by the way. So it includes tangible outputs involving polling, hub design, hub conversion that will be completed in mid-2026. And you can see the activities, again, marching it back leftwise. You'll talk to the community to gain their input, inform them about what the hub could offer, enter into hub design, and really start installing the features that will make the place a hub. And then finally, you see the items under inputs that we need to realize this vision. So with this, I encourage you to take this and try to put your funding idea or any program idea for that matter through the logic model framework. So you can see that it's sound, which can also equal fundable. Okay, next slide, please. I'm only going to touch on this very briefly, and this is what you can do to beef up your outputs, right? State them as SMART goals, make them specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And this, again, shows funders that you've done your work. Okay, next slide. This next one is just a brief note about taking the time to find and really cultivate your ideal partnerships rather than cold calling and introducing yourselves 2 weeks before the grant is due. And I know people have done this to ask for that support letter. So, I'm sure many of us have been in that boat. But the bottom line is to approach your partnerships carefully and with intent, especially those embedded in disadvantaged communities that everyone's been talking about, so that these partnerships are truly an asset in your proposal. Also, think about how to make the most of your existing partnerships where you have a good history of working together, perhaps around a successful Resilience Hub conversion project. Okay, next slide. So the next few slides are about how to search for the right funding targets, which can make all the difference as funders can spot whether or not something fits. And you can tackle this with some research. Okay, next slide. So this next slide notes that rather than chasing the money, you can develop each project idea using the logic model and SMART goals. You can prioritize them as an organization, figure out the framework around how the project will be completed, and then finally look for the right grant opportunity. Next slide. This spreadsheet shows a USDN tool that allows you to compare your project ideas against one another using the attributes that make a project compelling. So this is something you can create on your own such that your organization or agency can stay consistent with a process over time, including things like, do you have matching funds in place? And can you show that? Do you have an identified team to do the work? Community partners, community support, etc. What's important is to figure out what's important to you as an entity, as an applicant, and keep that consistent over time. Okay, next slide. This is just about figuring out, again, who will do what with the project, what your team is, how long it could take, how much it could cost. Next slide. The next few slides show various tools you could access to help you find that perfect funding opportunity that fits your project. So rather than looking at the funding opportunity first, which risks you chasing the money, you figure out your project idea and needs first, then find the funding to fit. So in addition to the example sites Emily noted in her presentation, you could certainly bookmark the resources our federal friends have mentioned, especially as new funding opportunities are posted each day. But you go through the next couple of slides until the green Hano slide, please. So next slide. Okay, this one. So yeah, one thing I want to spotlight here, Hano Grants Corner is a free searchable database. This is a Hawaii Alliance of Nonprofit Organizations. This is something that we curate for Hawaii nonprofits on a weekly basis, but it also includes other eligible entities where we've already done some screening out of those grants that are not eligible to Hawaii. It also includes state government, local government, and philanthropic and corporate sources for you to peruse, and this is all for free. Okay, next slide. In the final grant pursuit phase, now that you find the right grant, there's the application itself. And just the next couple of slides take a handy application checklist right out of the local government guide. So next slide, I'm just going to have you just look at these really quickly. These are checklists that you can go, put them on your bulletin board, go step by step from registration to ideation and application. Next slide. And then finally, in these final slides, there are resources available to you, okay? So go to the next slide to ensure that you have some help. This one, again, is USDN. So they have a federal funding technical assistance program they've run for the last 3 years to much success. And this is both across the country and right here, where we assisted Dottie Kelly Paddock in her Hawai'i Resilience Hub application for congressionally directed spending. And in the end, she was approved for $5.4 million. And next slide. This one is the program under Huanani Partners, as Gwen talked about, in the State Funding Readiness Project. And we helped her write for and secure the more than 62 million Solar for All grant. And that's also available. The next slide is the EPA designated Hawaiian Islands Environmental Finance Center and the Hawaii Community Foundation. And we know that water and wastewater are also important to hubs. So grants are available to any entities that would focus on water conservation, reuse, and recharge. And my final slide is the Ulupono Federal Funds Initiative. And this is done with through an MOU between Ulupono Strategies 360, us, SR, and the governor's office to assist state agencies and county agencies in any of these areas. But a lot of you could be partners in these as well. So in clean transportation for things like road infrastructure around your hubs or EV charging stations, renewable energy, fresh water and wastewater, and finally local food production. So these are available for you, and we encourage you to take advantage of that. The final slide after this is just the URLs and things for these programs. Okay, that's it for my portion. Turning it back to Ramona.
Mahalo, Melissa, and mahalo to everybody who participated as speakers. I know it's a whole bunch of information, but what it speaks to is in a time of looking for moving resilience, it's not all about money, right? It's about partnerships, it's about leveraging, it's about innovation. So I hope that our little journey today has moved you and that you're able to make progress on your resilience hubs or however you define it and you're working on resilience and community. And now for some final words, Adelina. And thank you again to all speakers and co-hosts.
As we come to the close of this year's Hawaii State Hubs Virtual Forum 2024, we would like to express our deepest mahalo to each of you for your time, mana'o, and commitment to the resilience of our communities. The knowledge and insight shared today remind us that the strength of our lahui lies in our unity and collective effort. The journey to building resilient communities across Hawaii is one of shared kuleana. Whether we are from urban centers or rural areas, we are all bound by the same aloha aina. And aloha kekahi I kekahi, love for one another. Together, we have the power to create lasting change by uplifting our communities and ensuring they are prepared for the challenges that lie ahead. Let us carry forward the mana of today's discussions with renewed dedication and a deep sense of kuleana to malama our people and our aina. I'm confident that through our continued work together, we will build a more resilient Hawaii for future generations. Mahalo nui to all our speakers, organizers, and participants for making this forum a success. And a special mahalo to Ramona Mulehi for her leadership in bringing us together, as well as Dr. Miku Lenentine, who's been in the background but has done so much to bring us all together today. I leave with you this final thought. In unity, we are stronger, and through aloha, we will continue to thrive. I will now turn the time over to Phil for his closing remarks.
Mahalo, Atalina. Wow, so much information, so much great information. I think maybe a lot of us came here with looking for opportunities for funding. We see that there's plenty out there. Maybe we have to shift our focus to our capacity to pursue how many of these opportunities. Just remember that we're all here in the same kind of journey. So I encourage you all to reach out to other participants, reach out to our speakers. Let's all try to stay as connected as possible in these times ahead. And mahalo everyone for coming. Thanks for being part of it. I will pass it to Jill now for her final remarks.
I was going to say stay 100% behind the scene, but there's 1 minute left. That's it. That's a wrap. So I know I would almost say like soft close, but it's been 2 hours and we've all been just like right at our screens following all this information. So thank you so much everyone for coming. We will have the recording, the chat, the slides. We even have handouts for you to share, to bring back to your communities. And just like Phil, you're saying, like, and we can use each other's resources too, right? So I know for one, Atalina and I have been talking here about maybe having a working group specifically dedicated to this for our island-wide network here. And just thank you so much, everybody. And we'll close it there, and we'll be in touch. Yeah, thanks everybody.
Mahalo.
Mahalo, everyone. Mahalo, Ramona. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. So good to see you all. Aloha, everyone.